Good morning, friends. Welcome to, I believe, part 23 of OBE Journal 2017. And thought we'd start this morning with a meditation projection OBE. That's the title of it, included in my blog a couple of years back, and now part of the book Embracing Your Divinity Instead of Your Doubt. And it's quite relevant to the discussions we've been having of late. And it's written from the point of view of Astral Gordon, and gives a few notions of how differently that aspect of the me that was born physically in 1952 sees things. Now, of course, Astral Gordon wasn't necessarily born in 52. Physical Gordon was. But certainly Astral Gordon, or the astral entity that assumed the evolutionary capabilities of that incarnate soul, has been around since then, and probably longer. I, quote unquote, take my place, the zone of comfort from which I cruise. I, quote unquote, sink into the moment, the now of the room, and prepare to evacuate the form of the body. I, quote unquote, move into the mind, or that share of it allotted to the quote unquote me of identity and biography, and feel the vibrations of thought energy quickening the pulse of my being. Then the quote unquote I am next to the quote unquote me, observing that familiar other who carries the burden from dawn past dusk, while I cavort feather-like and fancy-free. I know him well, him me less so, as he forgets much of what I bring to the table every morning before waking. It lodges in the recesses of his consciousness, filed yet available should he care to unearth. But he is busy with the body, society and their demands, and inspections are rare and often relegated to quote unquote later. I, of course, am the astral body, the projection from him, the physical body, born of woman. That's a good one. That sort of implies that the astral Gordon identifies with the male gender, and I'm not so sure that's the case, but it sort of implies that. I depart the room to fly over the nearby lake. Its being engulfs, and I pass through it gladly, skimming the waters and zooming at the city, soaring up suddenly as I near the skyscrapers. A familiar thrill, but one I never tire of. Does he, the other, seated and breathing, feel my exhilaration? I believe this time he does. He follows at a distance, taking notes. The life of the city. I feel it vibrating, a giant cloud of cross currents, an aura of almost infinite complexity. After years of feeling magnetized by some quality of vibration or another, and being sucked into the vortex of its location and practice, I have recognized all my Achilles' heels and can observe the ghost of the draw at my leisure. The habits which obsess much of the population no longer have a hold on this quote unquote me. No longer tempted, I have emerged from the egg of innocence and desire. Or maybe in my adventure, I have merely ascended to another level whose subtle allures have yet to be unmasked. Only in the astral equivalent of time, which is definitely not time as you know it, will tell. Ghosts at work and play. You meet a lot of them in this line, or at least you can if you so wish. Service as such is merely one option. You can in fact do anything and go anywhere if you so wish. It takes some unfolding of experience to realize this, as one's mental blinders and traditional sense of what's possible gradually disintegrate. Whether it's the surface of the moon, the inaccessible areas of the Vatican Library, the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, or the breathing heart of the solar logos, you can have that all areas access, all areas pass, if you A, understand that it's there, and B, allow yourself the privilege. Not surprisingly, timidity and low self-esteem can often prevent this, and many astral beings, much like myself, but minus my confidence, habituate the levels and spheres of the cultural and religious comfort zones. For example, rainforest natives of the spirit world will rarely be seen in the museums and concert halls of the spirit world cities. And dead bus drivers will not quickly be seen in the company of dead CEOs. As much for Gordon's note-taking self as anything, I move from Versailles to a lower astral hell realm, where a dead tyrant of my acquaintance is holed up in a ruined villa and the still frightened remnants of his earthly retinue. Hell realms have their fair share of ruined villas, some of them dating from Greek and Roman times. Although decay is definitely a factor here, it is not quite so relentless as on Earth. On my way to his preferred lair, I pass a couple of servants shuffling by, eyes down, terrified that contact may offend. I come and go as I please, and therefore am suspicious. The tyrant sits in his carved throne-like chair, making notes or plans on the papers in front of him. Land and power are to be regained in the next offensive. That I can sense. He dismisses me with a wave, without looking up. I prepare to harass him as I have done before. Disrupting the comfort zone of his denials and paranoias with well-placed barbs is my specialty, all in the hopes of loosening his grip on himself and those around him so they can all ascend out of their bondages and into spheres of light and joy. He's dissed my Christian do-gooderism many times and will likely do so again, but I can feel that every visit helps lubricate the rusty locks on his determination. The lower astrals have many willful bullies like him, scattered about various landscapes and structures, trying to maintain their illusions of belief and control. This one is Colombian, but they come from all cultures and epochs, as time and space are no longer at a premium in spirit. As I take my leave, walking conventionally rather than the puff of smoke magic act I tried the last time, a servant girl sidles up and asks to come along. This time there is no guard to prevent her, and I whisk her off to the Catholic South American mid-astral, where her community, with whatever number of her soul family members, have settled. It's almost an instant transfer, and someone, as always, is there to greet us. Someone she is comfortable with. In such a manner, repeated attempts by astral travelers like myself are the lower realms depopulated. Let me emphasize that. In such a manner, repeated attempts by astral travelers like myself are the lower realms depopulated. At least that's what we like to think as we ply our liberating trade. The newly dead are always arriving, and some of them, shaped by fear and ignorance, replenish the stocks. All the planes have a rotating population, souls coming and going, ascending towards the formless and descending into incarnation. The recently deceased, settled in their comfort zones of community, ethnicity, and religion, are slow to realize this. The more knowledgeable among us could be more proactive in encouraging growth, but they have adopted a more passive wait-and-see approach. Questions are answered, but they must be asked first. Courses, classes, and seminars are available and advertised for this purpose, but those who are perfectly happy in their paradise rarely attend. Yet a surfeit of pleasure can, and often does, lead to curiosity. The type of curiosity which finally wonders how the universe actually works and whether God exists or cares. Quote-unquote, Gordon has long recalled his participation in such quote-unquote night classes and assumes correctly that his physical plane teaching and facilitating was inspired by such. Readers of his books will already know this, as they may know something of their own nightly adventures, but readers of his blog may not. Many incarnate souls in all cultures travel nightly, most often for the fun of flying in the virtually gravity-free astral body, and secondly, to visit with their dear departed, where joyous reunions contrast markedly with the separation and sadness in the physical. Such strong emotions, anywhere on the spectrum, are the bond which holds the physical and astral planes so close, even when they seem distant. They are both predominantly worlds of emotion, where the heart learns its full repertoire of songs. As one ascends the planes, one becomes the products and playthings of thought and creative energy, and how one feels about anything is pushed to the background. Gordon wants me to venture through heaven worlds, and so I go there, the invisible guest, at various prayers, rituals, and meditations, covering the gamut of major world religions. The vibrations of devotion and worship are all too palpable here, or rather in all these heres. The longing and straining to access divinity from the island of individuality, apparent everywhere. At least to this me, the me that is conducting this experience, that Gordon might construct an educative narrative out of his partial memories and scribbled notes. Together we soak up the vibrations of spiritual yearning, with its various shades of celebratory glory, religiosity, piety, and pride in achievement. Souls unfolding from their identities, as Gordon notes, unfolding into the nothingness of consciousness without form, he continues. Moving into knowing and seeing that knowing is the boundary of omniscience, its outer layer, as it were. Knowing is the boundary of omniscience. I like that. An understanding that omniscience is one of the garments of God, her cloak of infinite colors, perhaps. With these many worshippers sharing their devotions, we see the limits of their understanding, etched in by their educations and religious traditions, and know that is what is holding them back from embracing divinity. Ultimately, one has to disappear into it, surrendering both the one's precious identity and pride in accomplishment. Not the easiest leap for an evolved individual. From here, I know Gordon wants to plunge to one of the pleasure centers, the holiday resorts of spirit, where the recently deceased pursue the sensual fulfillment and fleeting joys either denied them or indulged in to habit-forming status on earth. We roam an astral hotel in the astral Caribbean, taking in the sights and sounds. Here there is singing and dancing, there is sighing and groaning, and there's eating and imbibing. Out there are sports, the exercise and exhibition of beautiful bodies, and the hints of empty hearts and satiated desires. Endless pleasure, endless fun, children choking on cake and ice cream. Gordon feels we need not say more. Perhaps he's right. For now, anyway. Those of you who have been following the progress of these journals will know we've already described in more detailed fashion an exploration of one of those pleasure centers. And in that interaction from, I think, probably at least 3 years ago, you can see a slight reticence. But that's an early, at least for me, evocation of the astral self, whom the physical self does seem to follow. And I say seem because it's not immediately apparent. The projected self identifies with the astral self. The more you travel in it, the more you travel consciously in it. You wear the coat of the astral self, and that coat is made of the vibrations of the astral plane, and it is within your physical being as you face your day, interact with your day, but it is projected when you're asleep, and certainly sometimes projected when you're napping. There's no question about that. And there is a question about the possibility of projection while you move around your physical day. I think some adepts can do that. In fact, I know they can. And certainly the rest of us can do it when in meditation, focused meditation. And when you're doing your mindfulness meditation, you can definitely project and interact. As, for example, the retrieval I read from Bruce Moen's book when he's sitting in the restaurant rescuing victims from the Oklahoma City bombing. And I've certainly done that over the years, from time to time, projected for the sake of distance healing, contact of spirit, all that sort of thing. And you'll be familiar with this from the earlier videos. And I would suggest to you that if you feel up to it, do it yourself. It's if you've done a little bit of projection while asleep that's recalled as a lucid dream, then you can do it. Trust yourself, you can do it. And in fact, you are doing it. As I say to people who email me from time to time, I can tell they are doing it. You are doing it. The memories may be vague, incomplete, bits of jigsaw puzzle bits without the whole jigsaw completed. But there are certain details that people will give to me that are immediately recognizable, and there's a number of them. If you, for example, and this is just one, if you repeatedly have dreams, as some folk do from childhood, of taking people that you know for rides in cars, that's the brain placing on a familiar metaphor to moving about astrally and helping confused, ignorant, lost souls move on to the paradise worlds from some place of, sadness or tragedy or, darkness. And I can tell you, numbers of people have emailed me over the years who relate these sort of dreams and say, I've been having them since I was 5 or whatever, And they say it excitedly or amusedly or whatever, because they've been having them since before they fantasized about cars in a way that maybe a 10-year-old boy would fantasize about a certain classic car and therefore have a dream about one. I don't think 4 and 5-year-olds do that sort of thing. But anyway, any sort of dream where you're taking somebody, some people have them, they're on a bus with somebody and they're going somewhere. Ships, boats, yachts, all methods of transportation are ways of the brain placing a visual metaphor on top of your astral travel flying experience. The brain's in here physically, doesn't quite get that. There's a lot of things it doesn't get. Past lives is another thing it doesn't get, which is why when you're doing a regression, there'll be a voice over here saying, oh, that's not possible. You're just fantasizing. Look you're just pretending to be rich and famous and glamorous because you're a nobody now, or, all that sort of cynical commentary. And almost everybody gets that in regression work. Some variation of it anyway. Well, that's the brain talking, because the brain can't remember 1,000 years ago. The brain remembers stuff from when you were born and doesn't remember much of that either. So beware of the brain when you're working with your soul. The brain can be a jealous little puppy, especially if you're achieving all sorts of things without it. And of course, researchers of the brain will not admit that. And they can't admit it because they're applying their technology with little clips and stuff to the brain and measuring its, electrical impulses, reactions to certain stimuli. And recently I heard a very intelligent researcher into what happens when people are in a deep coma. And they try to, almost a vegetative state, or actually a vegetative state, what doctors call a prolonged vegetative state, the kind of thing where people are, being argued over by the family and physicians about whether that vegetative state is pointless and should be ended. And he had quite a bit of experience in this and spoke quite eloquently about various speaking to people in comas who are not communicating back. And as you spoke to them, watching various areas of the brain light up that suggested to them with their research that that being was conscious in there and was reacting. And some of these people did or were brought out or came out of the prolonged vegetative state. And later, whether it would be days, weeks, and I can't quite remember now. But interesting research, and certainly not anything I would deny. But what amused me was that toward the end of the discussion, the interviewer said to the researcher something about, well, I guess for you it's all about the brain. And he said, yes, we are our brains, quite emphatically and convincedly. And I thought, well, there's that world, that whole culture, subculture that is totally focused on the brain and what the brain sees, feels, reacts to. And those of us who participate in this type of activity, our little subculture, getting bigger all the time, of course, does not see the world that way at all. We know that lots of things happen when the brain is down there on the bed. We've looked at that being down there on the bed as we're floating up here. We've looked at it as we remerge with it when we come back. And we have an intuitive understanding, instinctive understanding, that the brain is the engine that drives that physical body. Completely useful for that task. Expertly designed for that task. But For the out-of-body stuff, not so. It was a moment, I'll tell you. And, you recognize the usefulness and pioneering area of research that this man and his colleagues were involved in. And more praise to that. We need to find out more and more, and we always do find out more and more about the mysteries of physical functioning, of which there are still many, of course. I'm not pretending that there's not. But I certainly am part of the team that explores the mysteries of astral and mental functioning. And of course, ultimately, it's all one. And we deal with many, many souls who are not illuminated or exposed to the experiences that we are, and will be in, denial or ignorance about them. And neuroscientists and all those types of categories of researchers are a big part of that. And unfortunately, they have a much more respected input into the mainstream culture than we do. Science is and has been for, in my mind, at least a couple of 100 years, and certainly more so since the tailing off of mainstream religion. Science is itself a religion. It has its dogmas and its teachings and its ability to pass or fail various levels of human activity and exploration by its very nature of being the high priests of perception and judgment that the media subscribes to. The media approach science and scientists on, cap in hand and on bended knee, and ask them, when I say scientists, I mean including psychologists who have the imprimatur of scientific study about their prejudices, People with prejudices and assumptions, unexamined assumptions, are quite marvelous at being the high priests of rationality and the scientific method, the so-called objective study of phenomena. When you and I know there is no objectivity, that we interact mentally with everything around us. And we realize this more, even more, when we're in the astral, because your mental projection can change the plasticity of all astral matter. The structures of things will change as you look at them if you want them to. And first of all, it happens, you don't know what's happening when you're a newbie, and then you realize that it's your mind and your imagination and your unconscious, so we say, projections that are doing it. Whereas scientists in the lab don't realize that. And I sometimes wonder if they ever will, because if they do realize that one's mental abilities, assumptions, projections have great power and can alter almost anything, including, I think quantum physicists realize this. They realize there's an interaction between mental perceptions of experimenters and the movement of subatomic particles. And they wind up arguing about the micro world versus the macro world. The macro world being this big world here of, buildings and chairs and trees and streets. And the micro world being the tiny little particles that whiz about, seemingly chaotically, but not really chaotically, that they study through electron microscopes and the like. And that's their way around that, because they can't accept or even begin to accept that our perceptions and assumptions and mental energy do affect the macro world, the big world. because it doesn't look like it. You look at a chair and it's still a chair. You look at your car and it's still a car. But those who have experimented with, in their own lives, with mental energies and machines that aren't functioning that well will tell you, and I've been reading about this for years, decades, that if you feed positive, loving thoughts to an old, slightly decrepit machine, it will work with greater efficiency and last longer. And but of course, that's not science. There's no proof for that. That's anecdotal. And for me, the universe is anecdotal. It's people telling anecdotes about their experiences. And I sometimes joke that what scientific objectivity is scientists getting together and telling each other anecdotes and agreeing that their anecdotes are similar and forming hypotheses out of the trail of anecdotes, because they need to. It's part of their, they need to survive. They need to do experiments in order to keep their positions in institutions, and they need to get funding to do those experiments. They need to get quite a lot of funding. And if they don't do those things, they don't play the game, they don't have a life, they don't have a career. So they've elevated their trail of anecdotes to a sacred status that cannot be challenged. A sacred status surrounded by jargon that often only they can understand. And that is exactly what priesthoods have done and still do in the world of religion. They adopt a powerful position beyond the regular populace, and through ritual, jargon, knowledge of ancient sacred texts, which only they can read. Don't forget the whole Latin Bible thing. For the longest while, hundreds and hundreds of years, only priests and only some priests could read Latin. But this spreads to all religions. And it often feels to me, as a student of these esoteric matters, and I've yet to see others agree with this position, that will agree with it anecdotally, that scientists are often on in our current world, on an evolutionary path, and are still pursuing the status, the special status, and ways of imposing their views on others from their lives as theologians, those who, priests, and those in the priest subculture of any religion, any culture. The hold they had over the mainstream culture, the populace, is replicated in their work as scientists. And that feeds their comfort zone on a slightly higher level of this, what we would call the spiral of evolution. They're doing much the same thing. They're defining reality and the rules and regulations of behavior from another aspect. And they're using all kinds of theoretical justifications and jargon to do so. I see it quite clearly, but I often, have trouble convincing others. Not that I need to convince them, but I offer it to you as a thought, as a series of thoughts. Do not let the analyses and hypotheses of science talk you out of the veracity of your experience. You'll have a hard enough time coping with your brain trying to talk you out of the veracity of your experience. So don't go the whole 9 yards and let the various forms of science including conventional psychology, which is incredibly materialistic in its view of things. Example, psychologists who are sincere and dedicated will not admit in any, maybe only in private at cocktail parties, that nasty spirits can have a malign influence on weak human minds. They will, control those weak human minds with drugs, and yet ignore, as does the legal services, ignore all those trials, which you see reported in the papers over and over again, of people hearing voices in their heads telling them to do things, and usually harm and murder others. And those of us involved in this work, the healing of souls who are being influenced, attacked by negative, malign, malicious spirits who are living in the between realm, as ghosts, and have this notion that where they are, not fully here, not fully there, they can operate as they wish without any karmic sort of response. And a lot of them do this because they've died with all kinds of issues and angers and resentments, and can't see why they can't continue their career of ruthless, nasty destructiveness, causing suffering to others. So they quickly find those of, let's say, weak mind, which might manifest as, schizophrenia, in the various related states that are reasonably well controlled by the drugs that pacify people right out. But as you know, they often say they're not forced by law, if they're not previously violent, to take those drugs. They can stop taking them, and as their families and friends will attest, he's fine when he's on the pills, but gets a little crazy when he goes off them. And they don't like being on the pills; they want to be off them. But many violent criminals or violent people who have committed crimes, or not career criminals, will say this in their testimonies. I've seen it over and over and over again. The voices told me to do it. And it's not an excuse. They are experiencing voices. And of course, psychology completely denies this or avoids it or circumvents it, because they don't believe in the reality of spirits and eternal life. They are a materialist science, just as all science is materialist. Now, the whole state of affairs whereby materialist science and the assumptions of materialist science have completely dominated our culture, and the mainstream aspect of it, which is endlessly promoted in the media. How that came about is a long story, I think. Certainly, it's part of the decline of religion, and the scientists would say, yes, the decline of magical thinking, thank God, and the rise of rationality. And certainly the rise of rationality in the much vaunted age of enlightenment accomplished certain things for human culture. It pulled us away from dependence on seemingly magic formulas and superstitions, and the ignorance of superstitions. But it replaced those superstitions with another set of, I don't know what you want to call it, unprovable hypotheses that were clung to by those who made their mark and sustained their careers by pushing those hypotheses. And let me remind you that the Big Bang as Rupert Sheldrake often points out, is in fact just a hypothesis. It is not a fact. And there's not that much proof for it either. Check it out sometime. People endlessly talk, especially people in the media that have, a reasonably good education but have no more than 5 or 10 minutes to study anything that they talk about, and usually less. But they have the training to talk about things convincingly, even if they know doodly squat about what they're talking about. And your average radio interviewer talking about the Big Bang has um, barely a notion that it's a hypothesis, that is something we are studying and testing, um, but it's not a given. It's not a fact. It's not a done deal. And it's just a small reflection of how this sort of thing goes on. And there's only a few voices pointing it out. I'm not really a voice in that field. Rupert Sheldrake is. Check out his work. Got plenty of videos. And but we just live with this notion of the materialist assumptions of all our college-educated smart folk are swamp the culture on many levels. Now, of course, they will say that in native and third world cultures, these assumptions are not, they don't reign supreme. But in terms of what's respected in the so-called developed civilizations of the West, and which are imitated by those in the East, like China, for example, that seek to follow that path for status and for progress, etc., etc. They reign supreme. Well, almost supreme. We have developed our alternate culture. But it's good to remember that as you explore your own mystical and metaphysical experiences in your astral body or your mental body, that you will always be dealing with those who cannot and will not do this. And one can only hope that the more inventive and exploratory of movies and books, particularly movies, that explore this sort of thing, can help open up the rest of humanity bit by bit. Because I don't see science doing it. Anyway, you'll find as you travel that if you talk to whoever, anyone in your extended family of blood relatives and friends, most of them don't really care about the mental blinkers that we live with on the physical plane. They're too busy being liberated and having fun and being happy. And if they give some thought to it, as some souls that have been there for quite a while, they will have one of two attitudes. They'll say, well, that's the limitations you have to live with on the physical plane, just as you have to live with the limitations of, intense summer or winter weather. You adapt to that sort of thing. And the demands of the monthly bills have to be paid with, the fruits of your labors, and the other restrictions on your complete freedom that are part of this day-to-day world that we live in. They will have noticed that, and because they've had time to sort of think it all over, and there will be those also. You may be lucky enough to have one of those who have been there long enough that are already planning on coming back in order to take some career method or set of goals in order to help in any small way liberate mankind from those blinkers. And I have one friend whose elder sister who passed some years ago, at least 20 years ago, who has told him on his visits that she plans to reincarnate. She was an educated woman of North America and wants to reincarnate in what she would think of as the Far East to help improve the status of women there. And obviously that's working with the mental constructs and blinkers of those cultures which relegate women to a severely third-rate status, as we all know. So you will meet those various souls that are in those states. I don't think there's really any other state that I've come across. Like I say, there's those who are too busy adapting and having fun. Those who have been there a while and have meditated on this and see quite clearly the blinkers and limitations that we all have to live with, that they lived with in their past lives, and at least are recognizing that. And then the third group I see is those who are planning on coming back and to consciously alleviate or help alleviate in some small way those limitations, and move the pawns to the next square on the chessboard, because that's what evolution is all about: moving the pawns to the next square on the chessboard, moving just pushing the envelope a little more open. And when we're here, that pushing of the envelope does seem almost impossible. It's so resistant to change and growth. And yet, when we're there, looking back and meditating on it all, we can sort of see that that is really part of what we're doing, bringing more of the freedom of spirit into the limitations of matter. Spiritualizing matter, as some of the esoteric books I read when I was a young man said. And I thought, what's spiritualizing matter? Sort of some vague idea. But now I get it. You're bringing the freedom of the matter of the astral plane, which can be manipulated and moved around by your thought, like a clay sculpture, for example, and bringing the energy that it takes to do that, the high vibration, into the lower vibration of the physical realm. And by bringing the high vibration, sort of jack up, bit by bit, the lower vibration of the physical realm, the density of matter, and moving it up levels so that it can be manipulated more easily. So with the inspiring vision of spiritualizing matter, which we are doing and will continue to do every time we're here, including 100 and 200 years from now. And I say that to those of you who are saying to yourself, oh, I don't want to come back. I've had enough this time. Well, you may feel that way now, but when you've been in spirit for, 50 or, 100 or 150 years, you'll have a fresh energy and a fresh impulse to come back and join in the game. And we'll join in the game together 100 years from now. But we'll all have different names and different faces. Anyway, so long for now, friends.